Okay, my first question as we get started, has any of this been helpful for you? And if so, what has been most helpful? Yes, Donna?
Right track and lots of things,
Good.
but also raising still some questions that maybe today will help.
Okay. She said helping her to understand that she's on the right track with a lot of what she's been doing, but also maybe answering some other questions. Anyone else? Is there anything that has been helpful? Ben?
I have not thought in terms of short-term goals, like you brought up last week, so that was helpful.
Yeah. I wonder if you went home last night or last week and wrote down your 4 most important financial goals. Does anybody have an idea of what their 4 most important financial goals are? So no one does. Okay. Well, Donna does. Thank you. I think it's really helpful. Ben, do you have a sense of what? You don't have to tell us what they are, but.
Because it was good. Andy and I sat down with this yesterday, because you said it could take 20 seconds. It took us closer to 30 minutes. But my first one was billions, not millions. That was my first goal.
All right. Here's a man with vision right there.
We were joking, of course.
Well, it's helpful for you to know where you're going, because if you don't know where you're going, any path that you take will get you there. So hopefully that's been a little bit helpful. What we're going to try to do in the last session, and we're going to review first, again, our definition of biblical stewardship was the use of God-given resources coming from God for the use of God-given goals and objectives. The second thing was there's only 5 things you can do with your money. You can use it to live on, you can give it away, you can pay taxes with it, you can use it to repay debts if you have debts, or lastly, you can save it to accomplish your long-term objectives. Proactive stewardship is the continuous, ongoing use of limited financial resources for unlimited and changing alternatives. So we all have limited financial resources, but we have unlimited changing things that we might do with them. The 6 long-term uses of money are things such as financial independence, additional giving, additional lifestyle desires, maybe education for your children, maybe starting a new business, and things of that nature. So it's helpful to know where would you like to be 10 years from now, as opposed to where you are now. That will help you with your long-term goals. And then the 5 keys to financial success. Can anybody remember any of those? What was one of them?
Spend less than you earn.
There you go. Spend less than you make over a long period of time. The second is?
Put something aside for emergency.
Build personal liquidity. The third is avoid the use of debt. Okay. The fourth is set long-term goals, and then fifth, and probably maybe number 1, should be remember that God owns everything that we have. Last week we reviewed and talked about the 4 financial goals. We reviewed of where you are. The purpose of all those papers was for you to go home and look at what are my assets, what are my liabilities. Also, if you've never done any budgeting, you could have used those sheets to begin to get an idea of how much you are spending. Most of us don't really know what we're spending, but usually our projection is that it's a lot less than it really is. I remember working with a family one time, and we were meeting, kind of having a semi-annual meeting in June, and they had a number that they said, this is what it costs us to live every year. And by June, they had spent 3/4 of that number. So I said, are you planning not to eat for the rest of the year? And it's just because in their mind, they thought, well, we're not spending that much money. But then when they actually looked at it, they were spending a lot more than they think they are. And quite honestly, we're all it's very easy for us to spend more than we think we're spending, because We don't like the idea when we find out how much we really are spending, we might not be happy with that. But at the same time, it is what it is. And then just anything you can do to take steps forward to improve your situation. So we talked a little bit about our living expenses or our lifestyle. And do you remember there's one key word that went along with lifestyle? Anybody remember what that was? Okay. It was contentment. You know, the Bible says that we're responsible to provide for our own, 1 Timothy 5:8. But also, Paul says, I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I'm in, whether I have a lot or whether I have a little. I've learned to be content. And the key word there is learned, because sometimes we don't start out being content. And it really takes God to work in our life to make us content. And so today we're going to talk about 3 subjects. We're going to talk a little bit about investing, but not much. I just want to give you some principles that come out of the scriptures related to investing. We're going to talk a little bit about insurance. What's the purpose of insurance? And how much should you have or could you have? And then lastly, we're going to talk about wills and estates. And the thing about wills and estates is that it's going to affect every one of us. At some point, you're not going to be here, and you're going to go to your heavenly reward, but there are going to be people left behind. And so there's some things you can do to make life easier for them as you prepare for whenever that day happens to be for you. Secondly, is that some of us still have parents, and for you younger people, you have grandparents that are still alive. So there are things that we might be able to do now to make our lives easier when they're gone, if we can help them with some of these things. So we talked about these 4 steps. The purpose of investing and savings. Why do we save and why do we invest? It's really to accomplish the long-term goals that we believe God has given us, whether that's saving so that at some point you could stop working and live off of what you've accumulated at that point, or other things like that. And I just want to highlight these points. I'm not going to go and read the scriptures. They're in your outline there. But the world has a very different perspective on investing than the Bible does. So there's just a couple of principles here. The world believes that upward trends are inevitable. You know, the stock market's going to continue to go up all the time. God's perspective is that cycles are inevitable. There are going to be times of good times, there are going to be times of difficult times. There are going to be times of good times, times of difficult times. Secondly, the world teaches us that we should get rich quick. Why do people buy lottery tickets? Why do you think they buy lottery tickets? Because they hope they're going to win. Yeah. And then the statistics on people who actually win the lottery and what it does to their life are horrific in terms of what it does for their family. All of a sudden, they got 1 million new friends that they never had before. They got 1 million new family members they never even knew about. And it just doesn't turn out real well. Where God's perspective is that we preserve and we grow steadily, as it says there in Luke. The world's perspective also is a very short time horizon. Unfortunately, in our country, most companies are built with a very short-term horizon. What are going to be our earnings for the next quarter? They're not thinking about where we're going to be 5 years from now, where we're going to be 10 years from now. And yet God tells us that we should have a long-term horizon. The world tells us to spend or consume first. God's perspective is save or invest first. If you have money to set aside, save it rather than going ahead and spending it. The world tells us time is an enemy. Bible tells us time is a friend. You know, move slowly over a long period of time. The world tells you if it feels good, do it. The Bible says seek wise counsel. We have this thing called a sequential investment strategy. In other words, if you have money to invest, what are the things that you ought to do first? So number one, you should eliminate it if you have any high interest debt. So if you have credit card debt, would be probably in that category more than anything else. Car debt could also be in that category. Consumable debt, if you bought furniture or things of that nature, is always to pay off the highest one, the one with the highest interest rate. So I am counseling a lady who has American Express debt on her American Express card. And she's paying 18% of interest per year on her American Express card. And she owes about $25,000. So that's a lot of money every year that she's paying. Her best use of her money is to go off and pay that off as soon as possible, because she'll get an 18% return on her money by doing that. The second, have at least 1 month of living expenses in your checking account. The third is have between 2 to 6 months of living expenses in a liquid investment. In other words, something that you could turn into cash. So if you had it in a mutual fund or you had it in stocks or something, you could always sell those and get the money pretty quickly. And this goes back, last week I talked also, if you've never been exposed to any of what Dave Ramsey teaches, he has a book called The Total Money Makeover. It's an excellent book to help you to understand some of these basic principles. But he talks in there about the importance of saving 3 to 6 months so that if something happens in your life, you have money to pay for it. If your car breaks down or you have medical emergencies, things of that nature. And then fourth is save for major purposes and then accumulate to meet long-term debt. So sometimes people really want to get into the savings things, but they haven't done any of these other things first. They still have a bunch of debt. And of course, the world will tell you if you have a mortgage and you're paying down your mortgage, so you've built equity in your house, and equity is the difference between what your house is worth and how much you owe on your house. That's your equity. And the world tells you all the time that you should go and you should always borrow out that equity. And if you need a vacation, you ought to go borrow that money out of your equity in your house and go take a vacation. Or investment people will say, well, the best thing you can do is borrow that equity out of your house and invest it in something else. Well, that assumes that what you're going to be able to earn with that money somewhere else will be more than what you have to pay for it on your interest rate related to your mortgage. So a lot of the thinking of the world is really upside down. That's why the country is $21 trillion in debt. That's why the average person is personally in debt. There are statistics that probably 35% of people in America are bankrupt. Bankrupt means you owe more than you own. And many people in the housing, when the housing market went down in 2008, a lot of people got caught because they bought a house at this price, and now the house is worth a lot less than what they paid for it, but they had a mortgage at the higher rate, so they're what would be called upside down in their mortgage. But so remember, a positive cash flow is required to invest. You have to spend less than you make in order to be able to invest. And don't even think about investing until you've done these first three things, getting rid of your debt. Okay. Now, I thought this would be interesting. I just want to give you an idea of the power of savings. Okay. So here we got, number one, you had, let's say you had $1,000. Okay. If you had $1,000 at one time and you had a 10% rate and you invested it for 40 years, so especially for you younger people who are in your 20s, if you invested it all the way until you were 62, what would it be worth? Anybody have any idea of if you just had $1,000 and you put it in the bank and never put any more money in the bank between now and age 62, and you earn 10% a year on that, do you have any idea what that would be worth at the end? Any guesses?
25,000.
Okay. Yeah, it'd actually be worth $72,890. $1,000, if you put it in the bank, didn't touch it for 40 years, and you earn 10% a year, at the end of those 40 years, it'd be worth $72,890 because of compounding. The second one, if you put $1,000 a year and you earn 10%, but you only did it for 10 years, put $1,000 in for 10 years, and then you stopped. You didn't put any more money in that. Do you have any idea how much that would be worth?
2,000.
Pardon? No, that would be $492,668. So you put $1,000 in savings every year for 10 years and then didn't put any more money in, and you earn 10%, it would be worth $492,668. It really gives you, all this is to give you the idea of the power of compounding. Compounding means if I have $1,000 this year, I earn 10%. Next year, excuse me, next year I have $1,100. And then if I earn 10% on that, the next year I have $1,200 and something dollars. But it grows from time to time. Here's another one. If you don't do anything for 10 years, and then you put in $1,000 a year at 10% until age 66, how long would it take for you to catch up to number 2? So you didn't do anything for 10 years, but then you did it for 10 years. Your next, let's say from 20 to 30, you didn't do anything. When you got 30, from 30 to 40, you put in $1,000 a year and then stopped. How long would it take you to catch up to the first time if you just did it from 20 to 30? Okay. Well, the truth is you'll never catch up. It's just too late. And that would be, if you did that, you would have $298,000 instead of $492,000. It just talks, the whole idea here is the sooner you can begin to do something, the better off it's going to be. And then if you did number 2, where you put $1,000 in for 10 years only, at 10%, by age 100, you would have $12 million. And if you did number 3, you waited 10 years and then you did 10 years at $1,000, you would only have $8 million left. So the point is that it's important, for you to start saving and then to let it build over a period of time because it does grow substantially. There's something called the rule of 72, which says if you take whatever you have and figure out what the interest rate, how much you're going to grow per year, that'll tell you how long it takes to double what you have. So if you had a certain amount of money and you got 6%, it would take you 12 years for that amount of money to be doubled. And that's just a little statistic there. So what are some principles that we can use in investing? One is to save regularly and first, Proverbs 6, this is all in your notes. The second is work toward preservation and the steady growth of capital. Don't try to invest in something that's going to make you rich quickly. Number 3, have a long-term perspective. Number 4, diversify. Ecclesiastes, it says, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a serving to 7 and also to 8, so you do not know which evil will be on the earth. The idea is rather than putting all your money in one basket, is you might want to diversify and put it in the 7 or 8 different baskets. This is a good one. Spousal unity in decision making. Whatever you do with any of these things that we've talked about, if you're married, you really need to talk to your spouse about this because, again, I said last week that more of the situations where I found people in trouble, it's because oftentimes the husband did something that his wife encouraged him not to do, but he went and did it anyways, and now they're in a mess. A lot of partnerships are formed that way. A man goes into business with another man. His wife says, I really don't think this is a good idea. And by the way, the Bible encourages us not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. That's not about marriage. That can also be about business at the same time. And so really make sure that you and your wife are on the same page as you talk about these things. Seek wise counsel. Proverbs says, listen to counsel and receive instruction so that you may be wise in your latter days. There are many ways, many plans in a man's heart. Nevertheless, the Lord's counsel that will stand. And I would just, there's wisdom in a multitude of counsel. So is another proverb. Avoid high leverage. We talked about that. Monitor your anxiety. If you're nervous about doing something, there's probably a good chance that you shouldn't be doing that, because the Lord puts that in our heart, and He gives us a check in our spirit when we're moving in a direction that's not contrary. That's contrary to Him. And then establish limits in the amount that you will invest. The bigger barns is that parable where Jesus talks about the man that was doing great, and he said, I have so much, what am I going to do? I'm going to build bigger barns. And then the man died that day, and it says that he was not rich toward God. So as you do all this stuff, you shouldn't be investing any money if you're not giving. We talked about that in the first week. But, the real simple way of a financial plan is, pay God first, pay yourself second, that's saving and investing, and then live on the rest is a very simple way to take your financial principles. Principles for making good decisions. This came out of the book Knowing God by J.I. Packer. He has a chapter in there on decision making. And to apply that here, he says, personally think through the decision you're going to make. Think ahead, be willing to accept and listen to godly counsel, be willing to suspect yourself. In other words, step back and say, is this really smart what I think I'm doing? Suspect yourself, because a lot of times our own personal fleshly desires lead us to do things that maybe are unwise. Avoid personal magnetism. That means if someone's coming and they're trying to sell you something, you're just afraid to say no. Be careful about that. And then lastly, be willing to wait. Any questions related to the whole area of investing or savings and things of that nature? And I would encourage you to save every time you get paid, however you're paid, if you're on a salary or whatever, just to set aside a certain amount. And it doesn't have to be a lot. I mean, just to get in the discipline, if you can save $10 a week or $20 a week or whatever, you know your own situation. But the idea of just setting aside money, especially if you're younger, some of those multiplying numbers, you could be a multimillionaire by the time you're 60 if you just set aside a little bit of money and didn't touch it and let it grow and grow and grow over the years. And so we're going to talk a little bit about life insurance. And I don't sell life insurance. I've never sold life insurance. But life insurance plays an important role in people's financial life because of the purpose of life insurance. The purpose of life insurance is to provide or protect the family in the event of the death of the person insured. So think about that. The person, that answers the question of who do you buy life insurance on? Because if the purpose of life insurance is to protect the family in the event that this person is no longer around in the family, that will help you know. And again, it goes back to the whole idea that we're supposed to be mindful about providing for those after us. So ask these questions. Who should be insured? Should the husband be insured? Should the wife be insured? What about if you're single? What do you need insurance for? But again, if you go back to the purpose of insurance, the purpose of insurance is to provide for the family or provide for whoever's left when you're gone in the event that you're not gone. So if you're single, do you think you need life insurance?
Not much.
Not much, because who's responsible? Who's going to...
Funeral expenses?
Yeah, you might have to pay. There would be funeral expenses for those left behind. So there's not a great need for you to have insurance if you're a single person. What if you're the husband and you're the one who's the main income provider for your family? Do you need insurance? Yeah, you do, and you probably need a lot. Okay, we're gonna, there's a little, in your notes there's a calculator where you can figure out how much you ought to have. But yes, and what about the wife? Does your wife need life insurance? I would say if you've got little kids, you need to have some insurance on your wife. Because, you know, there was a time in our life we had 4 little kids. And I thought, you know, if something ever happened to Sue, I'm dead. Because, number one, I can't stop working because I'm the main provider. But someone's going to have to help in assisting and taking care of these kids. Now, we had a lot less insurance on Sue than we had on me. But I just wanted to buy myself some time because I knew that if something did happen to Sue, I would have to get help for a number of years before the children started to get old enough to take care of themselves. So in that case, we had insurance on her. We don't have insurance on her anymore because our kids are grown and they left. Pamela's still with us, but Pamela and I do well. As she can do many things for herself. So another question is how much life insurance should they have? We'll look at that in just a second. And then another question is how much can you afford? Because let's say you come up with a calculation, you say, you know, I ought to have $500,000 of insurance or $1 million of insurance, but I just can't afford it. Well, then you just buy as much as you can afford. Because I've just seen too many situations. This was a number of years ago, a fellow, he was an executive in Walk Through the Bible, if you've ever heard of that ministry here in town. And he was 42, he had a heart attack and died. He had 4 kids at home. He had $40,000 worth of life insurance. Can you imagine what that life was going to be like for his wife from that point on? So, I mean, this isn't all about, you know, we're trying to make the family wealthy. We're just trying to provide for the family, especially if you got little kids. And I tell young couples, there are 2 things that you need to have if you're a young couple. Number one, you need to have a will, not because you got a vast estate to pass on, but because you have to decide who's going to take your kids in the event that you and your spouse are taken away in a common accident. So let's say you get in a car wreck, you and your wife are killed, who's going to take care of your kids? If you don't have a will, the state of Georgia will decide who's going to take your kids and raise your kids. And you probably don't want them making that decision on your behalf. What Sue and I did at that time when our kids were little, we had a couple in our church that we knew well. We went to them, we asked them if they would be willing to take our children in the event that something were to happen to us. And then we set up our financial situation so that whatever we had would go into a trust that this couple would be able to use because, you know, we had 4 kids. It was going to make their expenses quite a bit more. But we set that up and they said, yeah, we'll do that. And we explained to them how they would be able to be taken care of to take care of our kids in the event that that happened. But I mean, that's one reason as a young couple, once you have a child, you absolutely need to have a will just for the guardianship issue. The other reason that, the other thing you need to do as a young couple is you need to probably buy a lot of life insurance. And term insurance is the kind of insurance you would buy. In other words, it just goes for 1 year. You pay a premium at the end of that year. Your insurance is gone. You pay the premium the next year, as opposed to a whole life or a universal life policy. We won't get into the details on that, but the point is that you need 2 things. You need a will for where you want your children to go, and then secondly, you need life insurance to protect the family, especially the wife, if you're the main income earner in that. And should you purchase life insurance on your children? And because this used to be a big deal, you know, life insurance agents say, well, if you love your child, you ought to buy life insurance on them. Well, it's not going to do them any good because they're not going to be here anymore. The whole purpose of life insurance on your children would be to help you pay funeral expenses in the event that God were to prematurely take one of your children home. So don't get caught up and don't let I don't know if there are any life insurance salesmen here, but don't be bought on the idea that if you really want to save for your children's future, buy them life insurance. Don't ever do that. If you know you can't afford their funeral expenses, you might buy a little policy for that. But if you're interested in your kids' long-term future, put that money into one of the multiplying accounts that we talked about, and let that money accumulate for them, as opposed to thinking that insurance is a way for you to provide for your children. There is a website, it's in your notes, this lifehappens.org/insurance overview. If you go to that website, you can put your own numbers in it, and it talks about how much do I need for myself, whatever the education needs of our family. You can fill that out, and that will tell you, it will give you a number for how much life insurance you should have. So it's a great, useful website. Another quick way to calculate it is to take income that needs to be replaced. So if you're making $60,000 a year, you take that number, multiply it times 15, that'd be $750,000. That would be a guideline as far as how much life insurance you should have for yourself. And again, in your handout, there's a worksheet where you could just fill in the numbers, and that would also bring you to a number as far as what you need. And then when you come up with what you need, then you have to ask yourself the question, what can I afford? Maybe you can't afford that, but you can afford something, and you ought to have something. And another thing about life insurance is the older you get, the more expensive it is. And I usually would encourage people, if you're buying life insurance, you want to buy what's called level term insurance. Level term means you will pay the same amount for whatever that term. So if you get a 10-year level term policy, you'll pay the same premium for 10 years. Then by that time, your costs will be much higher than they are now. So you might do a level 15-year or a level 20-year. I mean, depending upon your situation, but that's a thought there. Any questions regarding insurance, life insurance? Okay, so you could do that analysis. We'll kind of close with this one here. I like this part here. It says, the reality of life, I will die. I will take nothing with me. I will probably die at a time I did not plan to die or anticipate. Somebody else is going to get my stuff, and I can only decide before I die who gets my stuff after I die. Now, if you don't decide, if you don't have a will of your own, and statistically, only 8% of people in the United States have a will. That means that 92 out of 100 people do not have a will. So if you do not have a will, you are normal as an American. You may be unwise, but you certainly are normal. And if you do not have a will, the government has a will for you. Because so many people die without a will, the government had to come up with a will as to what would happen. I'll tell you what happens in Georgia if you have a will. But let's look a little bit about what does God's word say. It says, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. So God says it's a good idea for you to be able to leave something for those behind. But then in Ecclesiastes, I love this verse, it says, wisdom along with an inheritance is good, and an advantage to those who see the sun. For wisdom is protection, just as money is protection. But the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the lives of its possessors. If you had to either pass on wisdom to your children or money to your children, I would vote for wisdom all the time. There's a study that's done, I didn't put it in here, but Jonathan Edwards, someone did a study of Jonathan Edwards' descendants all the way through, over like 6 generations, compared to this other fellow, John Jukes was his name, who was a criminal. So Jonathan Edwards had a whole line of people that were missionaries, pastors, A couple of U.S. senators came out of Jonathan Edwards' family line, university presidents, lots of good things that people ended up doing. This other guy, he had so many murderers, so many robbers, so many people that were in jail. I mean, it just shows that when we talk about what we want to leave behind, money's not the most important thing by any means. It's not even close. But the values that you want to pass on to your children. And have you ever written those down? Have you ever written down, these are the things that I hope my kids remember. When I help people in putting together their will, I encourage them to write an introductory paragraph to their documents, which just says something like, to those who are left behind, your mother and I were people who loved Jesus Christ. He was the most important thing in our life. And our hope for you, as you take what it is that we've passed on to you, was that you would also come to love Jesus more than anything else in your life. Our hope is that you will raise godly children, that you marry godly spouses. And I mean, whatever it is that you're thinking about. Most documents, if you read them, you wouldn't know whether the person was a Christian or not a Christian. Why would we not want to write something like that in the document that people are going to read when you're gone? And I also encourage people that there is going to be a family meeting. It's just a matter of whether you're going to be there or not. Because they're all going to meet when you're gone, and they're all going to look at what you've left. So why not have it when you're alive and communicate to your family what it is you're planning on doing in your situation? Here's a couple more verses to think about. Again, I mentioned this last week, but I love the book of Ecclesiastes because, there's a guy, Solomon, who just really kind of screwed up in life. David left him and this is another thing. It's a great story if you want to think about legacies passed on. What could David have done for Solomon that he didn't already do? David left all the money to build the temple. Solomon he was in a great place financially, and Solomon became the richest person in the world at that time. But then he got into having all these different wives and following the different gods. And he really is a great story of an inheritance that went awry in his story. But I still think the book of Ecclesiastes is really good to give us a perspective on life. He says, "Thus I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he would be a wise man or a fool. Yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor, for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity." And then in chapter 2 he says, "When there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, then he gives his legacy to one who has not labored with them. This too is vanity and a great evil." So when you think about people leaving vast sums of money to their children, that can either be a good thing or a bad thing. So I often ask people to think about whether your inheritance is going to be a blessing or a curse to your children. Okay, so questions regarding wills. Who should have a will? I would say everyone should have a will. If you're single and you don't own anything, you probably don't need a will. Okay, and I'll explain, because the way your assets go, depending upon what kind of assets you have. The state of Georgia has a will for you, and the question is whether you will like it or not. And I'll tell you what that is if you do not have a will. And who's going to be the guardian for your kids? Because whenever you look at any estate, assets pass out of an estate in two ways. There are only two ways that they pass. They either pass by contract or they pass by will or trust. Or if you don't have a will, they go according to how the state decides. By contract. So if you have assets, if you have joint property, if you and your spouse own a house together, if you die, your spouse automatically gets your house. If you have a joint bank account, if you die, your spouse automatically gets your bank account. If you are a widow or a single lady, and one of your children is on your bank account along with you, when you pass away, that child gets the money in that bank account. You might say, well, I want my money divided equally among your kids. If your son or daughter is on your bank account, when you pass away, they automatically get that money that's in your bank account. Retirement plans. Usually if you have a retirement plan, they ask you to name a beneficiary. Well, that money doesn't go through your will. It goes exactly as you told the retirement company to pass on that asset. Life insurance is the same way. Life insurance does not go through your will. It goes based upon who you named as the beneficiary. And quite honestly, if you're going to be charitable at the end of life, the best assets for you to give to charity are your retirement assets. So for most of the people that I work with, they name their spouse as the primary beneficiary of their retirement plans. And if something happens to their spouse, it usually goes to the charities that they want to give to. Because otherwise, if it goes to your estate pays income tax on your retirement account. It's just not a wise way to do it. If you have assets in trust, if you have a living trust and you've moved assets into a living trust is different than a will. A will can, there's two kinds of wills you can have. You can have a will that just decides what's going to happen to your stuff, or you can have what's called a pour-over will. A pour-over will, basically the will is very simple. It's a short will. It just says everything I have pours over into this living trust. And the living trust really becomes how you're going to distribute the assets that you have. So if you have assets in a living trust, those will go according to who the beneficiaries of the living trust are. I know some of this, these are terms that you don't deal with on a regular basis. But the point is that most people think that, well, if I don't have a will, what's going to happen to all my assets? If you have retirement assets, joint property assets, joint bank accounts, life insurance, it's not going to pass through your will. It's going to go however the contract went. And so what does pass through a will? Okay, basically three things. Personal property, if you own a car and it's in your name and you die, that has to be probated, and that will go according to how your will decides. Or if you don't have a will, how the state of Georgia decides. If you have a business and it's in your name, that will go through your will. And if you have separately owned property, and again, that could be, it could be an investment you bought, it could be a piece of land that you own. If you own a piece of land and you don't own it jointly with your spouse, that asset will get probated and that will be distributed according to how your will says to distribute it, or how the state of Georgia tells you to distribute it. Okay, so what happens if you don't have a will? In Georgia, this is in Georgia. If you're a child, if you have a child but no spouse, then your child will inherit whatever you have. If you have a spouse but no children, no descendants, your spouse will inherit everything. This is the one you don't like. Number 3, what if you have a spouse and descendants? Let's say, you're married. In our situation, we were married and we had 4 kids. What would happen to our estate? Sue would not get our estate. Our estate would be divided by 5. It would be divided by Sue and my 4 children. So even if your children are minors, it still gets divided that way. Now it says that the spouse and descendants equally share the property, but the spouse's share must not be less than a third. So in that situation, Sue would get a third of our estate, of my estate, and then the other 2/3 would be split among Sue and our other 4 children. So that, a lot of people don't realize that. They just think, well, if you're married, something happens to me, of course my wife gets it. Well, if you have children, that's not what the state of Georgia tells. And every state is a little bit different, but most of them are this way. They take it because they don't want to leave the kids destitute, so that's why they set aside money. And if your kids are little, then you're going to have to report every year to the court what you did with the assets that were in your kids' names. If your kids are minors, they'll give you responsibility over those assets, but you're going to have to report to the court what you do every year with the assets of your children. If you have parents but no spouse or no descendants, your parents get everything. And if you have siblings but no spouse or descendants, siblings will get everything. Any questions on this at all? Okay.
Question.
Yes.
Do all this planning, just like you've kind of outlined in general, and then in your latter years of your life, you find that you need some liquid cash. So you have a home equity loan. The house is paid for. The bank says you can't have a home equity loan because you have a trust. It's in the trust.
Because
you don't have first access to
the asset because it's in the trust, yeah.
Is there other options?
Well, we talked a little bit, Lyle asked a question about a reverse mortgage, whether that's something you could do. You probably can't do that unless you own the house. So you would, in that case, because if it's in a trust, if it's a living trust, as opposed to if someone else set up a trust for you and you were the beneficiary of that trust, you may be the beneficiary, but you don't own the asset. So the trust owns the house. In that situation, you would probably not be able to do that because the bank wouldn't be able to attach that house. But if it's a living trust, and sometimes people move assets into a living trust. If you put money in a living trust, it avoids probate, which isn't really too bad in Georgia, but probate means it has to go through the court before you can do anything with any of the stuff that you own. In that case, you could move it out of the living trust into your own names, and then you would be free. The bank would be able to have access to that in the event that there's a home equity line. But I would talk to your attorney. Generally, if it's in a living trust, you can move it back out because you moved it in. You own it, even though it's in a living trust, so you can move it out just as easily as you could move it in. Any other questions? Okay, here are some other questions. Who's going to be your executor or trustee? The executor or trustee, if you die, someone you name, usually if you have a will, you name someone to be the person. It could be called the personal representative, it could be called the executor, the person who will manage your estate in the event that something happens to you. So a lot of times people, obviously they name their spouse in the event that the first one of the two passes away. If both of you are gone, you may name your children. I would just encourage you need to be careful about whoever you name as the executor. It's not an easy job. I mean, they have to handle the estate, and you have to be careful depending upon the relationships that your kids have with each other, who is the right one to name, or should you name 3 of your kids, if you have 3 kids, as executors, so they have to agree together on what needs to be done. In that situation, if you ever did that, I would say that any 2 of them, if 2 of them agreed, then you can make a decision. I had a situation recently where this family left their 3 children as executors, but all their decisions had to be unanimous, and that they didn't get along, and it was a disaster. So, but the executor is someone who's going to manage your estate and distribute it according to what your instructions were over a period of time. How much do you leave to your children that will be a blessing and not a curse? Again, every family is different and every situation is different. But you have to think about, if you have a child who's a spendthrift, and if I leave him a certain amount of money, it's going to be gone within a year, then you might not want to leave that money outright to that person. You might want to put it in a trust or some other vehicle so that he or she can get the income off of it, as opposed to just getting the money outright because they're going to spend it. Will you include charitable giving in your estate? I mean, that again is a decision that you make with sometimes with families when they have a certain number of children. I just say you ought to name charity as another child. So I have a person, he had 3 children, and I said, well, why don't we name charity? Because he was charitably minded, wanted to give at the end of his life. But we just named charity as the 4th child. So 1/4 of his estate went to charity. Will you make gifts to your grandchildren? I'm very nervous about making gifts to grandchildren without the parents approving of that. Because your parents, your kids, or the parents of your grandkids are really responsible for their own children. So you need to be careful and you need to think about that before you make outright gifts to your grandchildren without the parents being in line. And last one, will your spouse know what and where your assets and liabilities are? You know, again, every family's different, but in a lot of cases, you know, I put together something called Memo to My Wife, where I wrote out for my wife, because I do the finances in our house, where everything is. You know, the will is in this drawer, you know, at the bottom, and this is the person you call about this, and this is the person you call about that. So if you have any questions about any of this stuff, please feel free to ask me. But thanks for the chance just to share some of this. I hope some of it's been helpful for you as you look at your own situation. Again, every family's different. There's no one way of doing things. But I think as we seek to honor God with what we have, then some of these things can be helpful. Let's pray as we close. Lord, we do thank you that you actually own everything. All the things that are in our name are really in your name, and help us to steward well what you've given us, and help us to glorify you with what we have. And we thank you for your word, which gives us guidance in each one of these areas. Just help us to apply it in our own situation. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. You're welcome.
I was thinking, did you ever see Jake Morgan's will?
No.
So he had to find like his first thing was, he had billions of dollars. So his first thing was Lord and Savior. Conway for his sins that he made. It was like, and this is what we do to accomplish, or something like that. But to your point about finding something what is important to you, I just think about it.
You're still projecting it.